The rain didn't just fall, it clawed at the windows of Evelyn Thomas's small, isolated bungalow, each drop a frantic scratch against the glass. A thunderstorm of this magnitude wasn't unusual for the outskirts of New Orleans in late September, but this one felt different. It felt personal. The wind howled like a grieving animal, and the darkness outside was absolute, a thick, inky blanket that swallowed the world whole. In Pataud, the only light came from a single flickering lamp on her desk, casting long, dancing shadows across walls lined with books on veterinary medicine. It was 2:37 a.m. Bang, bang, bang. The sound was heavy, desperate, cutting through the storm's chaotic symphony and making Evelyn's heart leap into her throat. Who would be out in this? At this hour? She lived alone, a fact the whole town knew. Her solitude was an unspoken rule. She held her breath, listening. Maybe it was just a branch, torn loose by the wind and thrown against the house. But it came again, louder this time, more urgent. Slam, slam! It was punctuated by a low groan, an agonized sound that was nearly stolen by the wind. Her blood ran cold. Every instinct, every horror movie she'd ever seen, screamed at her to stay put. But that groan, it touched the part of her that had spent years learning to heal. With her heart hammering against her ribs, Evelyn crept to the door, pressing her eye to the peephole. At first, she saw nothing but a swirling sheet of rain and the frenzied darkness. Then a flash of lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the porch for a split second. And he was slumped against the railing, a tall silhouette drenched and broken. One arm was pressed tightly against his side, and even through the deluge, she could see the dark stain blossoming across his white shirt. His head was bowed, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. As the world plunged back into darkness, the image was seared into her mind, a fallen god, bleeding in the heart of the storm. With a choked sob of terrified resolve, she unbolted the door. He stumbled in, bringing the storm with him. The scent of rain, ozone, and something else, something metallic and coppery, filled the small room. He was bigger up close, his presence sucking all the air from the space. He collapsed against the doorframe, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The dark stain on his shirt was terrifyingly real. Blood, so much blood. "Thank you," he grunted, his eyes finally lifting to meet hers. They were the color of emeralds, but sharp and hard, glittering with a fierce, untamed light even in his weakened state. There was no gratitude in them. There was only assessment, possession. As if by opening the door, she had sealed a contract she hadn't been allowed to read. Evelyn's fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach. "You need a hospital. I'll call an ambulance." He reached out, his fingers surprisingly strong as they wrapped around her wrist. The contact was like an electric shock, a jolt of raw power that traveled straight through her. "No hospitals, no police," he commanded, his voice a low thrum that vibrated through her bones. His gaze swept over her, from her wide, terrified eyes to her bare feet on the wooden floor. "You'll fix this, right here." She stared at the blood, then back at his intense, unyielding eyes. She was a veterinary student, not a surgeon. I can't. This is a gunshot wound." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a chilling sight. "Then you'll learn fast." He released her wrist, his hand leaving a trail of fire on her skin, and pointed a blood-slicked finger toward her living room. "Now get your kit, we don't have much time." Evelyn found herself moving, her body obeying before her mind could protest. The rational part of her brain was screaming, but a deeper, more primal instinct had taken over. She was trapped. Trapped by the storm, trapped by her own compassion, and trapped by the sheer, terrifying force of the man bleeding on her floor. The next hour was a blur of nightmarish focus. Evelyn worked under the dim, unsteady glow of her desk lamp, the storm outside providing a relentless soundtrack of chaos. She had fetched her largest veterinary suture kit, sterilized instruments in boiling water, and pulled on latex gloves with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The man, he hadn't offered a name, and she was too terrified to ask, lay on her antique rug, a rug she now knew would never be the same. He had directed her with clipped, precise instructions, his voice strained but never losing its edge of command. The bullet went through, clean entry and exit. "You just need to stop the bleeding and stitch the muscle. Can you do that, little bird?" he'd murmured, his eyes half closed, but still unnervingly fixed on her. The nickname sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "My name is Evelyn," she said, her voice tight as she irrigated the wound with saline. "I know," was his only reply. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by his sharp, controlled breaths of pain and her own frantic heartbeat. She stitched with a concentration born of pure adrenaline. The skin was different from an animal's, but the principles were the same. Close the layers, keep it clean, prevent infection. He didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, merely watched her, his gaze an unnerving weight. She could feel his eyes tracing the line of her jaw, the nervous tremor in her fingers. It felt less like he was her patient, and more like she was a specimen under his microscope. Finally, she tied the last knot and taped a sterile bandage over the wound. Her entire body ached with tension. "It's done," she whispered, peeling off the bloody gloves. "It's the best I can do. You'll need antibiotics." He pushed himself into a sitting position, a low grunt escaping his lips. The movement was fluid, powerful, belying the serious injury he'd just sustained. He looked at her work, then back at her. "You have a steady hand, Evelyn Thomas." The way he said her full name sent a fresh wave of fear through her. It confirmed her darkest suspicion. This was no random stranger. His arrival was not a coincidence. "How do you know my name?" she asked, backing away toward the kitchen, creating a futile distance between them. He ignored the question, his eyes scanning her small, tidy home with an owner's appraisal. "You live here alone, no family nearby. Top of your class at the Tulane University School of Veterinary Medicine. You volunteer at the local animal shelter on weekends. You are predictable." Each detail was a nail in the coffin of her anonymity. He had researched her. Why? How? "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice cracking. He rose to his feet in a single graceful motion. He towered over her, a predator in her safe, quiet den. He took a step closer, and she flinched back until her shoulders hit the kitchen cabinets. He raised a hand, not to strike her, but to gently trace a loose strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was shockingly gentle, yet it felt more threatening than a weapon. "My name is Valentino Caruso," he said, his voice a soft, dangerous whisper that was somehow louder than the storm. "And you've just proven your worth." The name meant nothing to her, but the arrogance in his tone told her everything. He wasn't a common criminal. He was something else entirely. "My worth? For what?" His emerald eyes darkened, the ghost of a smile returning to his lips. It was a smile that promised secrets and ruin. "For your new role." He leaned in closer, his scent a mix of rain, blood, and an expensive sandalwood cologne. His breath was warm against her ear. "From now on, you're mine." The words, so possessive, so absolute, hung in the air between them. They were a declaration, a verdict, a cage snapping shut around her. The storm outside raged on, but Evelyn knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the real storm had just moved inside. And it had a name: Valentino Caruso. Evelyn's breath hitched, trapped in her lungs. The words "you're mine" echoed in the unnerving silence that followed. A sentence that rewrote the laws of her universe. Her mind, a whirlwind of fear and disbelief, struggled to form a coherent thought. This couldn't be real. It was a stress-induced nightmare, a hallucination brought on by the storm and the trauma of patching up a bleeding stranger. "No," she finally managed to whisper, the word barely audible. It was a pathetic attempt at defiance, a flimsy shield against an overwhelming force. You can't say that. You're in my house. You'll leave in the morning, and I'll forget this ever happened." Valentino watched her, his expression unreadable. The ghost of a smile had vanished, replaced by an unnerving placidity. He took a step back, breaking the intense proximity, and slowly began to unbutton the cuffs of his ruined shirt. "Mourning is not an option for us, Evelyn, and forgetting is a luxury you no longer have." He shrugged out of the blood-soaked fabric with a wince of pain, revealing a physique that was all lean, hard muscle, corded with scars that told 1,000 violent stories. Her single stitch-up job looked amateurish against the tapestry of his past. Her eyes were drawn to the ink that covered his chest and arms, a complex web of symbols and Baroque patterns she didn't understand. He saw her looking, and a flicker of something, amusement perhaps, crossed his face. My enemies know I was hit, he stated, his tone matter-of-fact, as he tossed the shirt onto her armchair as if it were his own. They know I went to ground somewhere in the swamp. They will be looking, and when they find this house, they will not knock politely. The reality of her situation crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't just him she had to fear. By opening the door, she had painted a target on her own back. "So, what are you going to do?" she stammered, her mind racing through impossible escape scenarios. Valentino walked into her kitchen, his bare feet silent on the linoleum. He opened her refrigerator, peering inside with a casual air that infuriated and terrified her in equal measure. He pulled out a bottle of water, twisted it open, and drank deeply. He corrected her, setting the bottle down on the counter. "What are we going to do? First, we wait for the storm to break. Then my people will come, and you will come with me." "Come with you? Where? I'm not going anywhere." Her voice rose, bordering on hysteria. "I have a life here. I have school. My job." "Your predictable life," he finished for her, his voice flat. He took a phone from the pocket of his trousers, a sleek black device that looked impossibly unscathed. He tapped the screen once, his thumb hovering over a single contact. "That life is over. You can have a new one, a better one where you never have to worry about student loans or the rent on this sad little house." He looked up, his emerald eyes locking onto hers. "Or you can have no life at all. The choice is yours, but you have to make it now." Her nerves frayed, her breath coming in shallow pants. This was a nightmare, a choice between a cage and a coffin. She stared at him, this beautiful, terrifying man who had bled on her floor and now offered to either own her or erase her. The air was thick with the scent of sandalwood and blood, a perfume of dangerous promises. The intensity of his gaze was a physical weight, pinning her in place. For a dizzying moment, beneath the terror, a flicker of something else sparked, a morbid curiosity. What would a life with him even look like? Before she could answer, the low thrum of helicopter rotors began to beat against the storm. It was faint at first, then grew steadily louder, a mechanical heartbeat drowning out the thunder. Valentino smiled. A true, chilling smile this time. "It seems my enemies are more impatient than I thought." He strode toward the main window, moving with a predator's grace. Evelyn remained frozen in the kitchen, her spine chilled. The sound of the helicopter was almost directly overhead now, a deafening roar that shook the very walls of her small house. A blinding white searchlight suddenly cut through the darkness, sweeping across the yard and flooding her living room with sterile, invasive light. Valentino turned away from the window, his face cast in stark relief by the sweeping beam. He looked directly at her, his expression grim. "Do exactly as I say," he commanded, his voice cutting through the noise. "Your life depends on it." The searchlight swept past the window, plunging the room back into a disorienting cycle of shadow and flickering lamplight. The roar of the helicopter remained, a constant, oppressive presence that seemed to press down on the roof. "Stay away from the windows. Kill the lamp." Valentino's voice was a low, urgent growl. He moved with an astonishing speed that belied his injury, grabbing Evelyn by the arm and pulling her down behind the bulky armchair where his bloody shirt lay discarded. Her breath caught in a choked gasp as her knees hit the floorboards. He extinguished the lamp with his free hand, leaving them in near-total darkness, the only illumination coming from the intermittent flashes of lightning and the searchlight slicing through the trees outside. "They're not the police," Evelyn whispered, the obvious statement sounding foolish even to her own ears. "The police are the least of our worries," Valentino breathed, his body pressed close to hers in the cramped space. The warmth of his skin was a stark contrast to the cold fear gripping her. She could feel the hard planes of his chest, the steady, controlled rhythm of his breathing. For a man being hunted, he was terrifyingly calm. "They'll circle twice more. If they don't see movement, they'll assume the tracker was damaged and move on to the next grid." Tracker. The word sent a fresh spike of ice through her veins. He was being tracked like an animal, and that tracker had led them directly to her doorstep. They waited in suffocating silence, the world reduced to the sound of the storm, the helicopter, and their own breathing. The searchlight painted the walls in ghostly white strokes, once, then twice. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, her fingers clutching the worn fabric of the armchair. She felt Valentino's hand on her back. A firm, steadying pressure. It wasn't a comforting gesture. It was a reminder of his control, a silent command to remain still. Just as he'd predicted, after the second pass, the thrumming of the rotors began to recede, moving eastward until it was once again consumed by the thunder. The immediate danger had passed, but the tension in the room remained, coiling tighter and tighter. Valentino released her and rose, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. Evelyn stayed on the floor, her limbs trembling with adrenaline. "Get up," he said, his voice devoid of any softness. "They'll be back. We have to move." "Move where?" "In this storm. We can't just go outside." "I have a place, a few miles from here," he said, pulling his phone out again. He typed a rapid, encrypted message. "My men will meet us." He glanced down at her, still huddled on the floor. A flicker of impatience crossed his features. "I won't ask again, Evelyn." The finality in his tone broke her paralysis. Slowly, shakily, she got to her feet. Her home, her sanctuary, now felt like a trap, violated and unsafe. The life she had known just hours ago was gone, washed away by the storm and the bleeding man it had brought her. There was no going back. There was only forward, into his world. "I need my bag," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My cat." Valentino's eyes followed her gaze to a corner of the room, where a small fluffy ginger cat named Marmalade was peering out from under a bookshelf, his eyes wide with fear. For the first time, Valentino seemed momentarily surprised. He looked from the cat to Evelyn, a strange expression on his face. He was silent for a long moment. "Put the animal in a carrier," he said finally, his voice clipped. "Get whatever you need. You have 5 minutes." It was the smallest of concessions, but it felt like a monumental victory. As she moved numbly to pack a small go-bag, a change of clothes, her wallet, her keys to a life she might never return to, and coaxed a terrified Marmalade into his carrier, the full weight of her choice settled upon her. She was choosing the cage. A gilded cage, perhaps, one that promised protection and a life without worry, but a cage nonetheless. And the man holding the key was a ruthless killer who saw her not as a person, but as a possession, an asset. A tool he had acquired by chance in the middle of a storm. As she snapped the carrier shut, she caught her reflection in the dark glass of the window. The woman staring back was a stranger, her face pale, her eyes wide with a fear so profound it looked like a permanent part of her. She was no longer just Evelyn Thomas, the quiet veterinary student. She was the woman who belonged to Valentino Caruso. The 5 minutes Valentino had allotted her evaporated in a heartbeat. Just as Evelyn clipped the final latch on Marmalade's carrier, he was there, standing in the hallway. He had found a dark gray Henley in her late father's closet, the soft, worn fabric stretched taut across his broad shoulders and chest, a strange and unsettling appropriation of her past. He looked less like an intruder and more like the man of the house. "Time's up," he said simply. He took the go-bag from her unresisting fingers and slung it over his shoulder. He then reached for the cat carrier. "I can take him," Evelyn said, clutching the handle tighter. It was a small, desperate act of defiance, a claim over the last piece of her old life. Valentino's gaze was hard. "You will do as you're told. Give it to me." The command was absolute. Defeated, she relinquished the carrier. He held it with a steady, careful hand that seemed at odds with the violence he represented. He led the way to the back door, which opened into a small, muddy yard. The rain had lessened to a steady, miserable drizzle, but the wind was still sharp, whipping strands of wet hair across Evelyn's face. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. "Where are they?" she asked, her voice nearly lost in the wind. As if in answer, a pair of headlights cut through the trees at the edge of her property. A moment later, a long black SUV, the kind that absorbs light and reflects nothing, rolled silently up the muddy track to her back gate. It moved with a predatory stillness, its engine a barely audible purr. The passenger door opened and a mountain of a man in a black suit emerged. He was bald, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, and he held a large black umbrella. He moved with an unnerving efficiency, opening the rear door and holding the umbrella steady, creating a small, dry sanctuary in the midst of the chaos. He didn't look at Evelyn, his eyes fixed only on Valentino. Boss, the man said, his voice a low rumble. We had to circle. The area is hot. I'm aware, Roman, Valentino replied, handing the cat carrier to Evelyn before taking her arm in a firm grip. Get us out of here, quietly. He guided her toward the vehicle. As she slid onto the cold, buttery leather of the back seat, she felt a profound sense of dislocation. The interior of the SUV was another world. It was utterly silent, the roar of the storm outside reduced to a distant, muted whisper. The air smelled of rich leather and clean, sterile air. It was a hermetically sealed bubble of wealth and power. Valentino slid in beside her, and Roman closed the door with a soft, solid thud that sounded like a vault sealing shut. He got back in the front seat, and the SUV began to move, its tires barely making a sound on the wet ground. Evelyn stared out the heavily tinted window, watching her little bungalow, her entire world, recede into the darkness until it was swallowed by the night. She hadn't even had time to lock the door. The journey was shrouded in an unnerving silence. Valentino didn't speak. He simply sat beside her, his large frame radiating a dangerous energy that filled the confined space. He pulled out his phone again, the screen's glow casting an angular, blue light on his face. His thumbs moved with blurring speed, sending off a series of messages. Italian, she noticed, from the few words she could make out. Commands, reports, the casual administration of an empire from the back of a moving fortress. She risked a glance at him. In the intermittent glow of passing streetlights, his profile was severe and beautiful. Like a Roman emperor's on a coin. He seemed to feel her gaze and turned his head, his emerald eyes pinning her in place. You're safe now, he said, his voice a low murmur. The statement was so absurd it was almost laughable. Safe? She had never felt more in danger in her entire life. She was a prisoner, abducted from her home by a wounded Mafia boss she had just saved. Safe? She whispered, the word laced with a bitterness that surprised her. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if he were dissecting her tone. You were in the crossfire of a war you knew nothing about. Now you are under my protection. He leaned a fraction of an inch closer. There is no safer place to be, as long as you remember who you belong to. There it was again, that claim of ownership. She flinched away, turning to stare out at the rain-streaked, blurry lights of the city as they left the countryside behind. The SUV moved through the sleeping suburbs and into the heart of New Orleans. But it didn't head for the well-lit, tourist-filled streets of the French Quarter. Instead, it turned into the industrial district, an area of dark, converted warehouses and silent, empty docks. The vehicle slowed and pulled into the cavernous entrance of what looked like a converted textile factory from the 1940s, all exposed brick and huge steel-framed windows. A massive corrugated steel door rolled down behind them, sealing them inside a vast private garage that held a collection of cars so expensive, Evelyn felt dizzy just looking at them. Roman opened her door. Welcome to the penthouse, ma'am, he rumbled, his expression as impassive as ever. Valentino got out and came around to her side, taking the cat carrier from her lap. He looked up at the towering structure, then down at her, his expression holding a strange mix of weariness and resolution. This is your home now, Evelyn, he said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast silent space. Welcome to the cage. A private elevator, all smoked glass and silent, brushed steel, carried them upwards. Evelyn stood rigidly in the corner, clutching Marmalade's carrier to her chest as if it were a shield. Valentino stood opposite her, his powerful frame reflected infinitely in the dark walls. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. The only sound was the whisper-quiet ascent. It felt less like a ride and more like a final judgment, lifting her away from the world she knew and delivering her to an unknown fate. The elevator doors opened not into a hallway, but directly into the heart of the penthouse. The sheer scale of the space stole Evelyn's breath. It was a cavern of glass and steel, a 2-story atrium with a wall of windows that stretched 40 feet high, offering a panoramic, godlike view of the storm-ravaged city below. Rain lashed against the glass, but not a single sound penetrated the interior. The silence was absolute, unnerving. The decor was brutally minimalist. A vast, low-slung black leather sofa, a single abstract painting the size of a car, and floors of polished gray concrete that gleamed under the recessed, museum-quality lighting. It was less a home and more a monument to power and wealth, impersonal, while cold and intimidatingly vast. It was beautiful, but it was the beautiful, sterile beauty of a mausoleum. "Roman will show you to your room," Valentino said, his voice startlingly loud in the immense quiet. He had already walked to a massive black marble bar and was pouring himself a measure of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. He didn't look at her. He was already dismissing her. Roman, ever-present and silent, gestured down a long, dimly lit hallway. "This way, ma'am." Numbly, Evelyn followed. Her footsteps echoed on the concrete, a small, lonely sound in the vast emptiness. The hallway was lined with closed doors, each one identical, each one promising a secret she didn't want to know. Roman stopped at the last door on the left and pushed it open. The room was larger than her entire bungalow. A king-sized bed with a simple black headboard dominated the space. Another floor-to-ceiling window offered a view of the Mississippi River, a churning, angry ribbon of brown in the stormy night. A door on one side led to a bathroom that looked like it belonged in a luxury spa, and another door stood closed. "Your personal effects will be delivered in the morning," Roman said, his voice still a gravelly, impassive rumble. "The kitchen is stocked. The television has every channel. You will want for nothing. Except my freedom," Evelyn thought, the bitterness a sharp, acidic taste in her mouth. Roman's gaze softened for a fraction of a second as he looked at the cat carrier. "The boss said the animal can have the run of the place. Just not in his office." He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, and then was gone, closing the door behind him with a soft, final click. Evelyn was alone. She let Marmalade out of the carrier, and he immediately bolted under the bed, a small, terrified ball of ginger fur. She didn't blame him. She wanted to hide too. She walked to the closed door Roman hadn't explained and opened it. It was a walk-in closet, and it was full. Racks of clothes, dresses, sweaters, jeans, blouses, all in her size. A row of shoes, sneakers, boots, heels, all a perfect size 7. A jewelry box on a small vanity sat open, revealing delicate silver necklaces and earrings, exactly her style. Her blood ran cold, colder than it had when she was stitching Valentino's wound. This wasn't a guest room prepared in a hurry. This was a cage that had been built for her long before she ever knew it existed. The files he'd read, the details of her life he'd recited, it all coalesced into a terrifying truth. His arrival at her door was not a coincidence. He hadn't found her by chance. He had chosen her. A wave of nausea and a dizzying sense of inevitability washed over her. She stumbled back and sank onto the edge of the bed, the mattress impossibly soft beneath her. She was a doll in his dollhouse, a bird he had been watching for weeks, waiting for the perfect storm to pluck her from her life and place her in his gilded cage. The illusion of choice he had given her in her kitchen was just that, an illusion, a cruel piece of theater. Her fate had been sealed long ago. She heard the door to the room open. Valentino stood there, a fresh glass in his hand. He had shed the borrowed Henley and was bare-chested again. The bandage a stark white contrast against his tanned, scarred skin. His eyes swept the room, taking in her shocked expression. Her gaze fixed on the open closet. "I see you found the gifts," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "You've been watching me," she whispered, the accusation sounding weak and pointless. It was a fact, not a question. Diligently, he confirmed without a hint of shame. He took a sip of his drink, his emerald eyes glowing in the dim light. "I don't invest in assets without thorough research." "I'm not an asset," she spat, a spark of her old fire returning. "I'm a person." He walked toward her, setting his glass down on the nightstand. He stopped directly in front of her, forcing her to crane her neck to look up at him. He reached down, his touch surprisingly gentle as he cupped her chin, his thumb stroking her jawline. "You are whatever I say you are," he murmured, his voice a low, hypnotic caress. "And tonight, you are the woman who saved my life." He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear. "That makes you the most valuable thing I own." His words hung in the air, cold and absolute. Evelyn felt the fight drain out of her, replaced by a chilling emptiness. A person could fight an attacker, could reason with a kidnapper, but how did you fight a man who saw you not as a human being, but as an object he had acquired? An investment, the most valuable thing he owned. The sheer arrogance of the statement was so profound, so unshakable, that it left no room for argument. His thumb stroked her skin one last time before he released her chin. He straightened up, his gaze sweeping over her with a final, appraising look. "Get some sleep," he commanded, his tone shifting from possessive intimacy to brisk dismissal. "You look exhausted. I need you rested." He turned and walked out of the room, not waiting for a reply. The door clicked shut behind him, and the sound was as loud and final as a cell door clanging shut. Evelyn stood frozen for a long moment, the ghost of his touch still burning on her skin. She listened, expecting the sound of a key turning in a lock, but there was none. He hadn't needed to lock it. Where would she go? The impassive guard, Roman, was surely out there, and beyond him, a fortress of steel and glass suspended 50 stories above a city she no longer recognized as home. Finally, her trembling legs gave way, and she sank to the floor, her back against the cold, lacquered wood of the bed frame. Marmalade, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, crept out from under the bed and tentatively nudged his head against her hand. Purring softly, she scooped him into her lap, burying her face in his soft fur. The simple, familiar comfort of her pet was the only real thing in this nightmare of luxury. Tears she hadn't even realized she was holding back began to fall, hot and silent. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a profound and terrifying loss, the loss of her life, her future, her very self. Every choice she had ever made, to study hard, to be kind, to live quietly, had led her to this moment. A prisoner in a billionaire's penthouse, owned by a killer. After a long while, the tears subsided, leaving behind a hollow ache. She knew she couldn't stay on the floor forever. Numbly, she stood and began to explore her prison. The bathroom was a study in black marble and chrome, with a rainfall shower head the size of a dinner plate, and a dizzying array of expensive soaps and lotions that smelled of things she couldn't name: amber, vetiver, and oud. It was a place designed for a woman who had everything, and it only made Evelyn feel poorer than she ever had in her life. She returned to the bedroom and walked to the immense window. The storm was finally breaking, the rain softening into a light drizzle. The clouds parted, revealing the glittering, wet tapestry of New Orleans spread out below her. The city lights twinkled like fallen stars, impossibly distant, impossibly beautiful. She was an observer, separated from the world by a wall of unbreakable, soundproof glass. An exhibit in a private museum. She thought about escape. Could she break the window? Unlikely. Signal for help? Who would see her 50 floors up in a deserted industrial district? The elevator was her only way down, and Roman was the gatekeeper. She was well and truly trapped. Her gaze fell on the closet again, on the rows of clothes that had been chosen for her. Anger, hot and sharp, pierced through her fear. He had researched her, planned for her, and stripped her of her own identity before they had even met. He thought he knew her, thought he could buy her compliance with silk dresses and expensive shoes. He thought he owned her. A tiny defiant spark ignited in the hollow pit of her stomach. He might control her body, her freedom, her very survival. He might own the cage, but he did not own her. Not her mind, not her will. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass, the city lights shimmering behind her like a captured galaxy. The terrified woman was still there, but now, deep in her eyes, there was something else. A flicker of iron, a glint of resolve. Valentino Caruso wanted an asset, a possession, a predictable little bird in a gilded cage. She would be his storm. The first morning in the cage was surreal. Evelyn woke to the unfamiliar sensation of sunlight streaming across her face, soft and golden. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean and a city that looked deceptively peaceful from her 50-story vantage point. For a fleeting, disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. Then, the memory of the night before crashed down on her, and the cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. She had slept in her clothes, too afraid to touch the pristine white sheets of the bed or the soulless, store-bought pajamas laid out for her. Marmalade was curled at her feet, a warm, purring anchor to her sanity. The vast, silent penthouse was unnerving in the daylight. The minimalist furniture and polished concrete floors seemed to absorb all warmth, all life. Hesitantly, she ventured out of the bedroom. The main living area was flooded with light, the panoramic view of the city even more breathtaking than it had been at night. There was no sign of Valentino or Roman. A tray sat on the enormous marble kitchen island. On it was a silver coffee pot, a single porcelain cup, a plate of fresh croissants, and a small bowl of fruit. Beside the plate was a single perfect blood-red rose in a slender crystal vase. The gesture was so jarringly domestic, so utterly at odds with the violence and terror of the previous night, that Evelyn didn't know how to react. Was this a peace offering, or just the standard care and maintenance for a new acquisition? A folded note was propped against the vase. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The paper was thick and expensive, and the handwriting was a strong angular script. Evelyn, do not leave the penthouse. Roman is outside the elevator. Anything you require, he will provide. There are books in the library, clothes in your closet, food in the kitchen. Make yourself comfortable. I will return this evening. We need to talk about the future. V. The note was unsigned, but the imperious V was all the signature it needed. No questions, no apologies, just a list of amenities and a command. Make yourself comfortable, as if she were a guest at a hotel and not a prisoner in his fortress. The final sentence chilled her to the bone. We need to talk about the future, her future, a future that was no longer hers to decide. Anger warred with fear. She wanted to throw the tray on the floor, to smash the delicate cup and shatter the vase. But she knew it would be a futile gesture, a child's tantrum that he would likely find amusing. Control, that was the game. And right now, he held all the cards. Instead, she poured herself a cup of coffee. It was black and strong, just the way she liked it. Of course it was, he knew everything. She spent the day exploring the vast, empty space, with marmalade trailing cautiously behind her. The penthouse had 3 other bedrooms, all as impeccably furnished and impersonal as hers. There was a home gym with more equipment than the one at her university, and there was the library he'd mentioned. It was a stunning 2-story room with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with thousands of books. Leather-bound classics, modern first editions, books on art, history, philosophy, war. It was the collection of a man who was both a scholar and a barbarian. As she ran her fingers along the spines, she felt a flicker of the morbid curiosity she'd experienced the night before. Who was Valentino Caruso? What kind of man commands a criminal empire by day and reads Marcus Aurelius by night? She found a section on medicine. Tucked between a dusty anatomy textbook and a modern treatise on pharmacology, she saw it. A brand new, shrink-wrapped copy of the primary surgical textbook from her veterinary program. The discovery was like a punch to the gut. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a message, a reminder of her role, of how she had entered his life, of the worth she had proven. He hadn't just bought her clothes. He had curated a life for her within these walls, a life that revolved entirely around him. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. Evelyn stood by the window, watching the city lights begin to twinkle on one by one. She had spent the day in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the owner of the cage to return. She heard the whisper of the elevator doors opening. She turned, her heart beginning to pound a heavy, rhythmic drum against her ribs. Valentino stepped into the room. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored dark suit, his white shirt open at the collar. He looked rested, powerful, and in complete command. The wound he'd sustained seemed like a distant memory. He was no longer the bleeding man from the storm. He was the king in his castle. His emerald eyes found her immediately, and a slow, possessive smile spread across his lips. I see you've made yourself at home, he said, his voice a low, velvety purr that sent a shiver down her spine. Good, now we can begin. Begin what? Evelyn's voice was steady. A small miracle she attributed to the icy resolve that had formed in her heart. She would not let him see her tremble. Valentino walked slowly toward the wall of windows, his back to her, and looked down at the city he seemed to command. The rest of your life, he said simply, as if discussing the weather. He turned, his silhouette framed against the glittering skyline. I told you that you are an asset, Evelyn. Assets have functions, roles to play. And what is my function, she asked, a bitter edge to her words. To be your personal, on-call medic? To be a decorative object in this mausoleum? A slow, appreciative smile touched his lips. You are direct. I admire that. He moved away from the window and sat on the edge of the massive leather sofa, gesturing for her to take the armchair opposite him. It was a command, not an invitation. She remained standing. His smile didn't falter. "Your primary function," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur, "is to be a civilizing influence, a piece of beauty and normalcy in a life that has neither. You will live here. You will want for nothing. You will be my companion when I am here. You will be a gracious hostess when I have guests. And yes, should the need arise again, you will use your steady hands to patch me up." He paused, his emerald eyes boring into hers. "In return for this, you will have my absolute protection. No one will ever harm you again. Your student debts will be erased. Your future financially will be secured beyond your wildest dreams." He made it sound like a business proposition, a generous one. But Evelyn heard the unspoken terms. Her body, her time, her life would be his to command. "And if I refuse?" she challenged, her heart hammering. The smile vanished. "Then my protection is withdrawn," he said softly, the words more chilling than any shout. "And I cannot guarantee what my enemies would do if they found you, or what I would do with an asset that refuses to perform its function." He let the threat hang in the air, potent and deadly. "Everything has a cost, Evelyn. Your life was the price for my own. Now you must choose how you wish to live it, in comfort or in constant fear." She stared at him, the choice a parody of freedom. It was then that she saw it, a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't random. This wasn't just about a woman who happened to open a door. There was more to the story. "Why me?" she whispered, the question that had haunted her all day. Out of all the houses, all the people in the city, why me? It wasn't a coincidence, was it? Valentino's expression became guarded. He stood up and walked to a sleek, minimalist desk in the corner of the room. He unlocked a drawer with his thumbprint and retrieved a small silver object, a hard drive. He tossed it onto the glass coffee table between them. It landed with a soft, heavy clink. "No," he said, his voice now devoid of its earlier silkiness. "It was not a coincidence." Evelyn stared at the hard drive, then back at his unreadable face. "What is that?" "It's a legacy," he said, his eyes dark with the weight of the past. "Your father, Dr. Alistair Thomas. You believe he was a simple, small-town veterinarian who died of a heart attack 2 years ago, correct?" The mention of her father was a physical blow. "What do you know about my father? Don't you dare speak about him." "I knew him," Valentino said, ignoring her outburst. "He was a brilliant man, a brilliant surgeon, in fact, before he gave it all up for a quiet life mending broken paws. But he had a weakness, a gambling problem. He borrowed a great deal of money. Money he could never repay." Evelyn's world tilted on its axis. "No, you're lying. My father wasn't a gambler." "He was," Valentino stated with cold certainty. "And he borrowed that money from a very dangerous man, the former head of the Caruso family. My father." She couldn't breathe. The air had been sucked from her lungs, from the entire room. The dots connected in a horrifying, unbelievable line. The Caruso family. This man, Valentino Caruso. He was the son of the monster her father had been indebted to. "When my father died," Valentino continued, his voice a low, hard rumble, "I inherited his empire and all his accounts, including the outstanding debt of one Dr. Alistair Thomas." He gestured to the hard drive. "That contains the ledger, the proof. Your father offered a form of collateral against the debt, something he considered more valuable than money." Evelyn was shaking her head, a silent, desperate plea for him to stop. She didn't want to hear it. She couldn't hear it. Valentino's eyes locked with hers, and in them she saw not a flicker of pity, only the grim finality of fate. "He offered his most prized possession," Valentino said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "His legacy? His daughter." The revelation shattered the last remnants of Evelyn's reality. It was a truth so monstrous, so fundamentally impossible, that her mind refused to accept it. Her father, the kind, gentle man who taught her how to ride a bike, who stayed up late helping her study for exams, who smelled of antiseptic soap and quiet integrity, could not have done this. He could not have sold her. "Liar," she breathed, the word a ragged tear in the suffocating silence. "You're a monster." And you're lying to justify what you've done. Am I? Valentino's voice was devoid of emotion. He picked up the hard drive from the table. Everything is on here, Evelyn. The transactions, the signed agreements, the correspondence. Your father was a desperate man. He made a desperate deal to save his own life, hoping the debt would be forgotten when he died. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. Debts are never forgotten in my world. They are simply transferred. He held the hard drive out to her. See for yourself. She stared at the small silver rectangle in his hand. It was a Pandora's beak holding a truth that could destroy the most sacred thing she had left, the memory of her father. To look would be to know, to accept the poison. To refuse would be to live in the shadow of doubt forever. Her hand trembled as she slowly reached out and took it from him. The metal was cold, heavy like a gravestone. Even if it's true, she whispered, her voice cracking, her gaze fixed on the hard drive in her palm. Even if he did this, he's gone. That debt died with him. As I said, Valentino replied, his patience wearing thin. Debts are transferred. He made a promise. The Caruso family is now collecting on it. You are the collateral, Evelyn, the final payment. He saw the fight, the denial, the utter devastation in her eyes. He saw the world he had just destroyed. For the first time, a flicker of something other than cold command crossed his face. It wasn't pity, but perhaps a sliver of understanding. This is a lot to process, he said, his tone softening almost imperceptibly. I will give you the night to adjust. Read what is on that drive, or don't. It makes no difference to the outcome. He walked to the bar and retrieved the glass he had left there. But understand this. Your life with me is not a punishment. It is a consequence. But it is also your only salvation. Salvation? She looked up, her eyes blazing with a fresh, hot wave of anger. From what? From a debt I never knew existed? A debt to monsters like you? From the people who shot me, he said, his voice turning to ice. They are not my enemies alone, Evelyn. They are the rivals of the Caruso family. They know about the ledger. They know about my father's assets, his outstanding accounts. His eyes darkened. They know about you. They were the ones who ransacked your father's old office after he died, looking for that drive. If they had found you before I did, you would not be standing here now. You would be a tool to be used against me, and then you would be a body to be discarded. He let the horrifying image sink in. So yes, Salvation, I am not the only monster in this story, little bird, but I am the only one who has an interest in keeping you alive. He finished his drink in one smooth motion and placed the glass back on the bar with a decisive click. My room is at the opposite end of the hall. Roman remains on duty outside the elevator. You will not be disturbed. He looked at her one last time, his gaze lingering on the hard drive clutched in her hand. Accept the truth. Accept your new reality. It is the only way you will survive. With that, he turned and left, his footsteps echoing in the vast, silent room. Evelyn was left alone, standing in the center of her gilded cage, the city lights twinkling obliviously behind her. In her hand, she held the key to her past and the lock to her future, and for the first time in her life, she was utterly, terrifyingly alone with the truth. The moment the door clicked shut, the strength that had held Evelyn together dissolved. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob, as the hard drive fell from her nerveless fingers and clattered onto the concrete floor. The sound was small, insignificant, yet it echoed the shattering of her entire world. Her father, a gambler, a liar, a man who had used her, his only child, as a bargaining chip in a sordid deal with the Mafia. The grief was a physical assault, a wave so powerful it buckled her knees. She collapsed onto the plush rug, curling into a tight ball as racking sobs tore through her. It was a grief born not of loss, but of betrayal. Every cherished memory was now tainted, every act of kindness recast as a lie. The father she had adored, the man whose memory she had enshrined as a paragon of gentle virtue, had never really existed. He was a fiction, and she was the price of that fiction. For what felt like hours, she lay there, adrift in a sea of pain and disillusionment. Marmalade patted over and nudged his head against her tear-streaked cheek, a small comforting presence in the ruins of her life. His soft purr was a reminder that some things were still real, still pure. Slowly, the storm of grief subsided, leaving in its wake a desolate, frozen calm. The anger she had felt toward Valentino was now a complex, tangled thing, overshadowed by the gaping wound of her father's deceit. Valentino was a monster, yes, but he was an honest monster. He had laid the ugly truth at her feet, while her own father had built her life upon a foundation of lies. She pushed herself up, her movements stiff and robotic. Her eyes fell on the silver hard drive still lying on the floor. It pulsed with a quiet malevolence, a portal to a past she desperately wished to unknow, but she had to see. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she picked it up and walked to the minimalist desk in the corner of the living area. A sleek silver laptop sat closed on its surface. She opened it. It powered on without a password, the screen glowing to life with a simple, empty desktop. It was waiting for her. She plugged in the hard drive. A single folder appeared on the screen, titled with her father's initials, AJT. With a deep, shuddering breath, she clicked it open. It was all there. Scanned ledgers written in a precise, cold script, detailing dates and sums of money that made her feel sick. Scanned copies of promissory notes, the signature at the bottom, her father's familiar looping script, a dagger to her heart. And then the final folder, labeled simply, Collateral Agreement. Inside was a single typed document. It was a cold, legalistic contract, but the words were a litany of damnation. It spoke of a final, unpayable debt. And in lieu of monetary settlement, Alistair James Thomas pledged the guardianship and future consideration of his only daughter, Evelyn Marie Thomas, upon his death, to the Caruso family, as a permanent and binding settlement of all outstanding accounts. There was a photo attached to the file, a school picture of her, aged 16. She was smiling, a bright, braces-filled, innocent smile, utterly oblivious to the fact that her image was being used to sign her life away. She slammed the laptop shut. The click echoed the final closing of a door on her past. The truth did not set her free. It chained her. It bound her to Valentino, not just by circumstance, but by the sins of her father. The story Valentino had told her was true, every horrifying word of it. His rivals would be looking for this ledger. They would be looking for her. Her new reality settled over her, not as a cage of steel bars, but as a complex, deadly chessboard. Valentino had placed her on the board. Her father had created her as a pawn. But a pawn, she thought with a flicker of cold fire, could still move. It could even, sometimes, become a queen. She stood up and walked to the window, staring down at the indifferent city below. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach. But it was no longer a paralyzing, victimizing fear. It was a new kind of fear, the fear of a soldier before a battle, a calculating, focused fear that sharpened the senses. Valentino was right about one thing. To survive, she had to accept her new reality. But acceptance, she realized, was not the same as surrender. She would live in his penthouse. She would wear his clothes and eat his food. She would play the part of the beautiful, civilizing influence. She would be his asset. But she would watch. She would listen. She would learn the rules of this savage, violent world that was now her own, and she would find a way to turn them to her advantage. When Valentino Caruso returned, he would not find a terrified, broken girl. He would find a woman who had seen the truth and had chosen to survive. He thought he had acquired a possession. He would soon learn he had armed an enemy. Evelyn didn't sleep. Instead, she showered, the scalding water washing away the grime of the last 24 hours, but doing nothing to cleanse the filth of the truth she now carried. She walked into the vast closet and, for the first time, looked at the clothes not as a prisoner's uniform, but as a costume. She chose the simplest thing she could find, a pair of black silk pajama pants and a matching camisole. The fabric was sinfully soft against her skin, a luxury that felt like a mockery. It was the armor for her first day in this new war. She spent the pre-dawn hours in the library, the silver laptop open in front of her. She didn't look at the hard drive again. She didn't need to. The truth was branded onto her soul. Instead, she began her research. She typed Caruso Family New Orleans into the search bar. The results were a sanitized, corporate version of the monster she now knew. Valentino Caruso was presented as a reclusive, enigmatic billionaire, the sole heir to Caruso Holdings, a global shipping and logistics empire. He was a philanthropist, a patron of the arts, with his name on the wings of hospitals, ambuls, and museums. But beneath the polished headlines, there were whispers. Tabloid articles, quickly scrubbed from the internet but archived on obscure forums, spoke of a ruthless corporate takeover artist. They hinted at connections to the city's underworld, of rivals who disappeared, of deals settled with violence instead of contracts. They called him the ghost of the Vieux Carré, a man who was everywhere and nowhere, a phantom who pulled the city's strings from the shadows. She searched for his rivals. The name that came up most often was the Falcone family, an old money crime syndicate, more brutal, more overt in their operations. The article spoke of a bloody, decades-long turf war between the Carusos and the Falcones, a war that had gone quiet in recent years, but had recently, according to anonymous law enforcement sources, reignited with a vengeance. It was the Falcones, she realized with a sickening lurch, who were likely hunting him. They were the ones in the helicopter. They were the ones who would see her as a tool, a piece of leverage. The abstract threat Valentino had described now had a name, and it was terrifying. When the sun rose, casting long golden shafts of light into the silent penthouse, Evelyn had a rudimentary map of the world she had been thrust into. It was a world of violent hypocrisy, where charity galas and back-alley executions existed side by side. She made coffee and sat by the window, watching the city wake up. When Roman entered, silent as a shadow, to retrieve the previous day's tray, he found her sitting there, calm and composed, a book open in her lap. She had chosen a leather-bound copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War from the library. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she didn't flinch. "Good morning, Roman," she said, her voice even. The big man was visibly taken aback for a second. He grunted a barely audible, "Ma'am," before collecting the tray and leaving as silently as he had come. It was a small victory, but it was a start. She had asserted her presence. She was not just a piece of furniture. The day passed in a quiet, tense rhythm. She ate, she read, she watched the city. She was gathering her strength, fortifying her mind. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but she was learning to wall it off, to tuck it behind a facade of cool composure. Valentino returned as dusk began to settle. He was dressed more casually today, in dark trousers and a soft, charcoal-gray cashmere sweater. He looked less like a CEO and more like a lord returning to his manor. He stopped in the entryway, his eyes immediately finding her in the armchair by the window. He saw the book in her lap, and a single dark eyebrow arched in amusement. "The Art of War," he said, his voice a low purr. "An ambitious choice. Are you planning a campaign?" Evelyn closed the book, her finger marking her place. "I'm learning the terrain," she replied, her voice calm. She stood to face him, a student before the master. "You told me to accept my new reality. I have. But if I am to be your asset, I need to understand the risks. I need to understand the enemy." Valentino's amusement faded, replaced by an intense, assessing stare. He had left a broken, terrified girl here this morning. He had returned to find a woman with steel in her spine. This was a new development, and he seemed both intrigued and wary. "The enemy is not your concern," he said, his voice hardening. "Your concern is to do as I say." "And what if doing as you say gets me killed?" she countered, taking a bold step forward. "You said my father's debt was transferred to me. That means his enemies are now my enemies. Your enemies are now my enemies. If I am to survive in this world, I can't be ignorant. I won't be." He walked toward her, circling her slowly, like a shark sizing up its prey. "You have a fire in you, little bird. I saw it when you stitched my wound. I see it now." He stopped in front of her, his proximity a suffocating blanket of power. But fire, if not controlled, can burn the very house it's meant to warm. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers brushing the sensitive skin of her neck. The touch was light, but it carried the weight of an unspoken threat. "Very well," he conceded, his voice a low whisper. "You want to learn the terrain? Then your first lesson begins now. Put on a dress, we're going out." "Going out?" The words were out of Evelyn's mouth before she could stop them, laced with disbelief. "Out where? You just told me your enemies are hunting you. Isn't going out in public insane?" Valentino's lips curved into a dangerous smile. Insanity is a matter of perspective, little bird. Sometimes the most visible place is the safest. It is a demonstration of strength. It tells my enemies that I am not afraid, that I am not hiding. He gestured towards her room. Now, as I said, a dress, something appropriate for the best restaurant in New Orleans. You have 20 minutes. His tone brokered no argument. Evelyn returned to her room, her mind reeling. This was a test. Every part of it was a calculated test. Her compliance, her choice of attire, her behavior in public. He was not just taking her to dinner, he was putting her on display. She walked into the closet, the rows of clothes mocking her. She ignored the vibrant, flashy cocktail dresses and the overtly seductive gowns. Her eyes landed on a dress of deep emerald green, the same color as Valentino's eyes. The material was a heavy silk that shimmered under the light. It was simple, elegant, with long sleeves, a high neckline, and a cut that was conservative yet hugged her form in a way that suggested strength rather than vulnerability. It was a queen's dress, the dress of a woman who would not be broken. She styled her hair quickly, letting it fall in its natural waves, and applied only a touch of makeup. When she emerged from the room, Valentino was waiting. He was shrugging on a tailored black suit jacket over a holster that held a dark, menacing handgun. The sight was jarring. He looked up as she approached, and his eyes swept over her. For a fraction of a second, the mask of command slipped, and she saw a flicker of genuine appreciation, a spark of heat in his gaze that was both terrifying and intoxicating. "An excellent choice," he murmured, his voice a low, velvety rumble. He held out his arm. "Shall we?" The gesture was that of a perfect gentleman, but the cold reality of the situation made it a mockery. Hesitantly, she placed her hand on his arm. The muscle beneath the fine wool was hard as steel. The warmth of his body seeped through the fabric. A dangerous, forbidden heat. The journey down in the elevator was silent, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was charged with anticipation. Roman drove them again, the black SUV gliding through the now calm city streets. They pulled up not to a flashy, well-known restaurant, but to a discreet, unmarked iron gate in the heart of the Garden District. The gate swung open without them stopping, as if anticipating their arrival. They were in a private courtyard, lush with overgrown ivy and lit by flickering gas lamps. The restaurant, Le Chiffre d'Or, the Golden Cipher, was an old Creole mansion, its secrets hidden behind walls of weathered brick and dark green shutters. The moment they stepped inside, a hush fell over the dimly lit room. The maitre d', a tall, severe-looking man, bowed his head. "Mr. Caruso, your table is ready." Every eye in the room was on them, on him. The air was thick with the scent of old money, expensive perfume, and fear. These were not ordinary diners. These were the power players of the city, judges, politicians, businessmen, all members of a world that operated in the shadows. And in this room, Valentino was not just a guest. He was the king. He led her to a secluded corner booth, offering a commanding view of the entire restaurant. As she slid onto the plush velvet seat, she felt like an actress thrust onto a stage without a script. This was the lesson, a demonstration of his absolute power. He didn't need to hide. The world hid from him. "To answer your earlier question," Valentino said, once a waiter had silently filled their water glasses and vanished. "This is the safest place for me in the city, because I own it and everyone in it." He gestured vaguely with his hand. "Judge Alistair over there. His daughter has a gambling problem, a problem I graciously help him manage. Senator Broyles by the fireplace. We funded his last campaign. They are all, in their own way, my assets, just like you." The cold, piquant, matter-of-fact way he spoke about owning people made her stomach churn. "So the lesson is that everyone has a price?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "No," he corrected her, his eyes intense. "The lesson is that everyone has a secret. Power isn't about money, Evelyn. It's about knowing the secrets. It's about controlling the narrative." Before she could respond, a man approached their table. He was handsome, with silver hair and a charismatic smile, but his eyes were cold and reptilian. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as he stopped beside them. "Caruso," the man said, his voice smooth but with a barely concealed edge of steel. "I'm surprised to see you out. I heard you had taken ill." Valentino leaned back in his seat. his expression one of bored amusement. He looked at the man as if he were an insect. "Falcone," he replied, his voice dangerously soft. "As you can see, I've made a full recovery." The name hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Falcone. This was the enemy, the man whose family was hunting them. Falcone's cold eyes shifted to Evelyn, his gaze lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "And you found yourself a new companion, a lovely one." He smiled at her, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "You must be very special, my dear, to have the ghost's attention." Valentino's hand moved, almost faster than she could see, and rested on top of hers on the table. His grip was like Harn, a silent, possessive claim. "She is with me," Valentino said, the words a quiet promise of violence. "And you are interrupting our dinner. I suggest you move on before you become ill yourself." The two men locked eyes, a silent war being waged across the table. The air crackled with a tension so thick Evelyn could barely breathe. She was no longer just watching the game. She was a piece on the board, sitting between two kings poised for slaughter. The silence stretched for a full 10 seconds, a small eternity where the only sounds were the distant clink of silver on porcelain and the frantic beating of Evelyn's own heart. Falcone's charming smile never wavered, but a flicker of something cold and calculating passed through his eyes. He was assessing her, weighing her importance, filing her away as a potential weakness. "Of course," Falcone said finally, breaking the spell. He gave a shallow, mocking bow. "My apologies for the intrusion. Enjoy your meal." He turned and walked away, melting back into the shadows of the restaurant as if he had never been there. The ambient hum of conversation slowly returned, but the atmosphere had been irrevocably altered. The veneer of civility had been stripped away, revealing the raw, predatory reality that lay just beneath the surface. Evelyn slowly exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hand was still pinned beneath Valentino's. His grip was painfully tight, his knuckles white. "Now you see," Valentino said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He was no longer looking at her. His eyes were tracking Falcone's retreat across the room. "The terrain is not a map, Evelyn. It is a minefield, and you just walk through it with me." He released her hand and she pulled it back into her lap, rubbing her wrist where the imprint of his fingers remained. "What did he mean, the ghost's attention, but attente?" she asked, her voice a near whisper. Valentino finally turned his gaze back to her. The mask of bored amusement was gone, replaced by a grim seriousness. "It's a name they have for me," he said dismissively, "because I am not like them. The Falcones, they are loud, ostentatious animals. They flaunt their power with violence and gaudy displays. I prefer to remain in the shadows. My influence is felt, not seen. To them, I am a ghost." A waiter appeared, silent and efficient, placing plates of exquisite food in front of them that Evelyn had no memory of ordering. Seared scallops, risotto laced with truffle, a salad of exotic greens. The rich aroma filled the air, but she had lost all appetite. "He knows who I am now," she stated, the terrifying realization dawning on her. "He saw me with you. That makes me a target." "It makes you mine," Valentino corrected her, his voice sharp. "Which makes you untouchable. He will not dare to touch you. To do so would be to invite a war he cannot win." "A war that started because his people shot you and left you to die in a storm?" she retorted, her fear giving way to a spark of anger. "It seems to me the war has already begun." Valentino paused, his fork hovering over his plate. He looked at her, and for a moment, she saw something other than a crime lord or a captor. She saw a man burdened by the weight of a legacy, a general commanding a bloody and relentless campaign. "You are not wrong," he conceded, a surprising admission. "What you are witnessing is the final act of a very old play. My father and Marco Falcone's father were partners once. They built the city's underworld together. But they had creative differences, a disagreement that ended in betrayal and bloodshed. The Falcones believe half of my empire is rightfully theirs. They have been trying to take it for 30 years. He took a bite of his food, his expression cold. "My father was content with a stalemate. I am not. He was going to end it. That was the unspoken message. He was going to eradicate his rivals. And he didn't care who got caught in the crossfire. She was caught in the crossfire." "This is your lesson, Evelyn," he continued, his voice low and intense. "Look around you. These people, with their polite smiles and expensive clothes, they are all players. They choose a side, or they are crushed between them. There is no neutral ground. He leaned forward, his emerald eyes burning into hers. I did not choose you by coincidence, and I did not bring you here tonight by accident. I brought you here to show you the world you are now a part of, and to show that world that you belong to me. His words were a confession and a branding. He was marking his territory. He was using her as a signal, a message to his enemies. She wasn't a companion, she was a statement. You need to learn to see the threats before they appear, he said, to read the lies behind the smiles, to understand that in this world, trust is a commodity more valuable and more dangerous than gold. He gestured with his fork towards the door. Falcone's appearance tonight was not a coincidence. He knew I was here. He came to see the woman who was with me. He came to see you. The realization was a punch to the gut. This entire evening, this lesson, had been a baited trap. And she was the bait. The food on her plate remained untouched. The rich, decadent flavors would have tasted like ash in her mouth. She was the bait. The entire elaborate performance, the dress, the restaurant, the public display, had been a calculated move in his war, and she was the unsuspecting pawn. A cold fury, clean and sharp, sliced through the fog of her fear. You put my life in danger, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. You brought me here knowing he would be here. You used me. Valentino met her gaze without a flicker of remorse. He took a slow sip of his wine, a deep blood-red vintage. I did, he confirmed, his voice calm. And you performed beautifully. You showed no fear. You looked like you belonged at my side. You showed him that you are not a weakness to be exploited, but a queen to be respected. I am not your queen, she hissed, leaning forward. I am your prisoner. The two are not mutually exclusive in my world, he replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He placed his napkin on the table. The lesson is over. It's time to go home. Home. The word was a slap in the face. He meant the penthouse, the cage. The ride back was a masterclass in tension. Evelyn sat as far from him as the spacious seat would allow, her body rigid, her gaze fixed on the rain-slicked streets outside. She didn't look at him, but she could feel the weight of his presence, the heat of his body, the faint scent of his cologne. He was an unavoidable force, a black hole that had pulled her into its orbit. She was no longer just a victim. A victim is powerless. But a pawn, a piece in the game, has a role to play. It has a purpose. And understanding that purpose was the first step toward finding a way out, or a way to survive. She broke the silence just as the SUV turned into the industrial district. You said power is about knowing secrets, she said, her voice clear and steady, surprising even herself. And about controlling the narrative. Valentino turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable in the dark. You are learning. Then tell me, she pressed on, turning to face him fully, her eyes locking with his. What is the narrative now? You've shown Falcone your new asset. You've made your statement. What happens when he decides to make a statement back by taking me? The directness of the question seemed to genuinely surprise him. He studied her for a long, silent moment, the city light sliding over the sharp planes of his face. He wasn't looking at a terrified girl anymore. He was looking at an opponent. A student who was learning the game far faster than he had anticipated. He can't take what is mine, Valentino said finally, his voice a low, confident growl. He thinks he saw a weakness tonight, a beautiful distraction. He is mistaken. What he saw was a warning. He knows that if a single hair on your head is harmed, I will burn his entire world to the ground. I will salt the earth where his mansion stood and erase the Falcone name from the pages of history. The conviction in his voice was absolute. It was not a boast. It was a promise. A terrifying, possessive promise of annihilation, all in her name. It was the most horrifyingly romantic thing she had ever heard. The SUV rolled into the garage, and the great steel doors sealed them inside. The journey was over, but Evelyn felt as though she had just stepped into a much larger, more dangerous world. When they were back in the penthouse, the silence felt different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken knowledge, with the weight of the war that was now her reality. Evelyn turned to him in the center of the vast living room. What is my next lesson? Valentino looked down at her, a strange, almost imperceptible softening in his eyes. He had expected tears, hysterics, pleading. He had not expected this cold, focused resolve. He had wanted a beautiful, civilizing influence, a piece of art to adorn his life. He was beginning to realize he had acquired a weapon instead. Your next lesson, he said, his voice a low murmur, is trust. He reached into his suit jacket and produced not his gun, but a small, sleek burner phone, and held it out to her. This is for you. It has one number in it, mine, and it has a tracking device, for your safety. She stared at the phone. It was another chain, another method of control. And my lesson is to trust that you won't use it to listen to my every conversation, to track my every move? She asked, her tone laced with sarcasm. No, he said, his expression turning serious. The lesson is for me to trust you, to trust that when you have the means to call for help, to betray me, you will not. He placed the phone in her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. Do not disappoint me, Evelyn. The consequences would be severe. He turned and walked toward his side of the penthouse, leaving her standing alone, the phone a cold, heavy weight in her hand. It was a test, a lifeline that was also a noose, and she had no idea if she had what it took to pass. Evelyn stared at the burner phone in her hand. It was a paradox, a symbol of connection that only emphasized her isolation, a tool of potential freedom that was also an instrument of surveillance. The lesson is for me to trust you. The audacity of it, the sheer manipulative genius of his words, left her breathless. He had framed her imprisonment as a test of her character, placing the burden of trust squarely on her shoulders while he held all the power. She spent the next few days in a state of hyper-awareness, the phone a constant, heavy presence in her pocket. She didn't use it. The temptation was a screaming, primal urge in the dead of night, but she fought it down. To call for help would be to sign her own death warrant. He had made that clear. This wasn't a game she could win by following the old rules. She had to learn the new ones. Valentino was a phantom in the penthouse. He would be gone before she woke, returning late in the evening. Their interactions were brief, formal, and charged with an unnerving tension. He would find her reading in the library or staring out at the city from the window, and they would share a silent dinner. The vast dining table a no man's land between them. He never asked what she did all day. He never asked if she was okay. He simply observed her, his emerald eyes missing nothing, assessing her as she settled into the gilded cage. She was settling, and that was what terrified her most. The luxury was seductive. The food, prepared by a chef she never saw, was exquisite. The silence, which had once been oppressive, was becoming a strange kind of peace. She was adapting. The human animal's instinct to survive was overriding everything else. She was becoming accustomed to the cage. One evening, about a week after the dinner at Le Chiffre d'Or, he returned earlier than usual. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was dressed in dark, functional clothing, and there was a fresh, angry-looking cut above his eyebrow. A faint metallic scent clung to him. Blood, not his own this time. He found her in the library. She was curled in a deep leather armchair, marmalade asleep in her lap. The silver laptop open beside her. She had been digging deeper, cross-referencing news reports of gang-related violence with the corporate movements of Caruso Holdings and Falcone International. She was learning. He stopped in the doorway, and for a moment he just watched her. She looked up, her heart giving a familiar, heavy thud at the sight of him. She saw the cut, the weariness in his eyes, the violence that clung to him like a shroud. "Rough day at the office?" she asked, her voice cool, though her pulse was racing. A dark, humorless smile touched his lips. "You could say that. A hostile takeover was averted." He walked into the room and poured himself a whiskey from the decanter on a side table. He drank it down in one go. "What have you been reading?" "Your competition's quarterly reports," she replied evenly. "They're over-leveraged, expanding too quickly into territories where they have no infrastructure. It's reckless, desperate." Valentino turned to her, his eyes narrowed with a new, sharp interest. "You have a mind for strategy, little bird." "I have a mind for survival," she corrected him, "and I've learned that my survival is currently tied to the success of Caruso Holdings." He was silent for a moment, studying her. The dynamic between them had shifted again. She was no longer just a beautiful object or a defiant prisoner. She was becoming useful, an advisor. "The Falcones made a move on the port tonight," he said, his voice a low growl. "They tried to intercept one of my shipments." "And you stopped them," she stated. It wasn't a question. "I discourage competition," he said simply. He walked over to a large antique globe that stood in the corner of the room. He spun it slowly. "But they are becoming bolder. Marco Falcone is a rabid dog. He doesn't care about collateral damage. He just wants to see my empire burn." He stopped the globe with his hand, his finger resting on a small, obscure island in the Caribbean. "Which is why we are leaving." Evelyn's head snapped up. "Leaving? Leaving where?" "My family has a compound on this island," he said, his back still to her. "It is private, secure, and far from the reach of the Falcones. We will be safe there. The final moves of the game will be played from a distance." A cold dread washed over her. Here in the city, she had felt trapped, but at least it was a world she knew. An island compound sounded like a different level of isolation, a true, inescapable prison. "When are we leaving?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Valentino turned to face her, his expression grim. "Roman is preparing the jet. We leave in 1 hour." He took a step toward her, his gaze intense. "And this time, Evelyn, you won't be bringing a go-bag. You will be leaving everything else behind. Forever." The hour passed in a blur of surreal efficiency. Roman appeared with sleek black suitcases, already packed. Evelyn had no idea where the contents came from, but she knew with a sickening certainty that they would be perfectly her size. She was being erased, her old identity shed as easily as a snake sheds its skin. She took one last look around the penthouse, her beautiful, sterile prison, and felt an unexpected pang of something almost like nostalgia. It was the first chapter of her new life, and now she was being forced to turn the page. The journey to the private airfield was silent and swift. A matte black jet sat waiting on the tarmac, a shark-like silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. There were no lines, no security, no other passengers. There was only Valentino's world, a world that operated on a set of rules entirely separate from the one she knew. As they ascended into the clouds, leaving the lights of New Orleans behind, Evelyn felt a profound and terrifying sense of finality. Valentino sat opposite her in a plush leather seat, his eyes closed. He wasn't sleeping. She could feel the coiled tension in him, the mind that was always working, always calculating. "You're quiet," he said, his eyes still closed. "You told me I was leaving everything behind forever," she replied, her voice flat. "There isn't much to say." His eyes opened, and they were dark, unreadable pools. "I gave you a promise of safety. An island fortress is the only way to guarantee it." "You mean it's the only way to guarantee your safety," she countered. "As I've told you," he said, a hint of steel in his voice, "your safety and my interests are now one and the same." They landed on a tiny strip of asphalt, carved out of a lush, green jungle. The air that hit them when the door opened was warm, humid, and thick with the scent of salt and tropical flowers. The island was a paradise of white sand beaches and turquoise water, a jewel set in the vast, empty blue of the Caribbean. And in the center of it, perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, was the compound. It was a sprawling modern villa of white stone and dark wood, surrounded by a discreet but formidable wall. It was a masterpiece of architecture, designed to blend into the landscape while simultaneously dominating it. It was beautiful, and it was the most secure, inescapable prison she could have ever imagined. The days that followed were a strange mix of idyllic tranquility and unnerving tension. There were staff, a silent, efficient housekeeper named Sophia, and guards who patrolled the perimeter with a lethal, unobtrusive grace. Evelyn had the run of the villa. She could swim in the infinity pool, walk on the private beach, and read any book from a library that rivaled the one in the city, but she was always watched. The guards' eyes were always on her, a constant, silent reminder of her status. Valentino was different here. Away from the city, some of the hard, calculating armor seemed to fall away. He worked for hours in a vast, glass-walled office overlooking the sea, but in the evenings, he would join her on the terrace. They would eat dinner as the sun set, painting the sky in fiery colors. He started to talk, not about his business, but about the island, about the books in his library, about the stars that emerged in the perfectly clear night sky. He was testing her, she knew, giving her a longer leash, seeing what she would do with it. He was trying to lull her into a sense of comfort, to make the cage so beautiful she would forget it was a cage. And the most terrifying part was that it was working. One evening, he came to her on the terrace. He was holding the silver hard drive. "I have a problem, Evelyn," he said, his voice serious, "and I believe you are the only one who can solve it." Evelyn looked up from her book, her guard immediately on high alert. Valentino's expression was one she hadn't seen before, a mixture of frustration and something that looked almost like vulnerability. "What kind of problem?" she asked, her voice cautious. He set the hard drive on the small table between them. "This is more than just my father's ledger. It's an encrypted archive. My technicians have been trying to crack the final partition for weeks, with no success." He tapped the silver casing. "The encryption is tied to a biometric failsafe keyed to your father's medical research. It's a sequence, a pattern, something only he would recognize, or someone who studied his work." The implications of his words slowly dawned on her. "My father's research wasn't just about animals," she whispered, thinking of the late nights he'd spent in his study, the complex journals he'd kept hidden. "No," Valentino confirmed. "His early work was in cellular regeneration, groundbreaking but controversial. He was afraid it would fall into the wrong hands, so he buried it, hid his genius behind a quiet country practice." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "The Falcones don't just want my empire, Evelyn. They want what's on this drive. They want your father's research. It has military applications. The ability to create soldiers who heal at an accelerated rate. It is a prize beyond measure." Her father's work, twisted into a weapon. The thought was sickening. "And you want it for yourself," she accused. "I want it kept out of the hands of men like Marco Falcone," he corrected her, his voice sharp. "It is a power no one should have. The encryption is the last line of defense. I need you to look at the data, at the patterns, see if you can find the key your father hid." He was asking for her help, not demanding it. He was admitting he needed her mind, her unique connection to her father's legacy. For the first time, she had leverage. She had something he wanted, something only she could provide. For the next week, they worked together in his glass-walled office. It was a surreal experience. She sat beside the most dangerous man she had ever met, a digital ghost of her father's life's work spread across the screen in front of them. Valentino was a surprisingly patient partner, listening to her theories, watching as she navigated the complex labyrinth of data. In these long hours, she saw a different side of him. She saw the brilliant strategist, the man who could see patterns others missed. She saw a flicker of the boy who had been forced to inherit a bloody and dangerous world. They argued over lines of code, debated scientific principles, and for brief, terrifying moments, she would forget he was her captor. He was just a man, a brilliant, complicated, and deadly man. The attraction that had been a spark of morbid curiosity was growing into a slow, dangerous ire. She felt it in the way her skin tingled when he leaned close to look at the screen, the way her breath caught when his fingers brushed hers as they pointed to a line of data. She hated herself for it, but the chemistry between them was an undeniable, elemental force. Finally, one afternoon, she found it. It wasn't in the complex equations. It was in the margins, a series of seemingly random annotations on cellular decay rates. But they weren't random. They were musical notes. A lullaby her father used to hum to her when she was a child, one he had written himself. It was a secret language between them, a final message from beyond the grave. "I've got it," she breathed, her fingers flying across the keyboard, translating the notes into the alphanumeric sequence the system required. The screen flickered, and the final partition unlocked. A single file appeared. It was a video diary. Her father's face, older and more careworn than she remembered, appeared on the screen. "If you are seeing this, Evelyn," his voice, raspy and filled with regret, filled the silent office. "Then the worst has happened. There is so much I have to tell you. The debt was real. But the story is more complicated than that. The Carusos, the Falcones, our families have a shared history, a secret that began long before you were born. The truth is not what it seems." Before he could continue, a single sharp crack echoed from the jungle outside. The glass of the office window beside Valentino's head exploded inward, showering the desk in a spray of glittering shards. Chaos erupted. A high-pitched alarm blared through the compound as red lights flashed along the hallways. Roman's voice, amplified and urgent, boomed from an intercom system. "Compound breach, north wall, hostiles on the grounds." Valentino moved faster than Evelyn could have imagined. In one fluid motion, he threw himself across the desk, tackling her out of her chair and shielding her body with his own as another round of gunfire peppered the spot where she had been sitting. "They found us," he growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble in her ear. His body was a hard, warm shield over hers. "There's a traitor." He pulled her to her feet, his gun now in his hand. His face was a mask of cold, lethal fury. The strategist was gone, replaced by the warrior. "We have to get to the panic room." He dragged her out of the office and into the main living area, where half a dozen of his guards, clad in black tactical gear, were taking up defensive positions. The idyllic paradise had become a war zone. The sound of automatic gunfire echoed from outside, a brutal counterpoint to the serene lapping of the waves on the beach below. They were halfway across the room when a massive explosion blew the main terrace doors off their hinges. The force of the blast threw them to the floor. Evelyn's ears rang, her vision swimming. Through the smoke and dust, she saw figures dressed in black pouring into the room. The Falconi. Valentino was up in an instant, firing his weapon with a deadly, practiced calm. He was shouting orders in Italian, pushing her behind the massive marble bar. "Stay down," he commanded. The firefight was brutal and terrifying. Evelyn huddled behind the bar, her heart hammering against her ribs. Marmalade's terrified meows coming from the bedroom. This was it. The reality of the world she had been dragged into, rendered in blood and bullets. She saw a Falconi gunman get a clear shot at Valentino, whose back was turned as he engaged two other hostiles. There was no time to think. She screamed his name. He turned, his eyes widening as he saw the gunman and the barrel of the gun aimed at his chest. He moved, but not fast enough. Evelyn acted on pure instinct. She grabbed the heaviest object she could find, a crystal decanter of whiskey, and hurled it with all her might. It struck the gunman's arm, causing his shot to go wide, shattering a priceless vase on the wall behind Valentino. The distraction was all Valentino needed. He spun and fired twice, the gunman collapsing to the floor. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes blazing with a fierce, wild emotion she couldn't name. The moment was shattered when he suddenly cried out, a sharp, ragged gasp of pain, and staggered back. A dark red stain was blossoming on his shoulder. He'd been hit. In that instant, everything shifted. He wasn't the invincible crime lord. He was the bleeding man from the storm all over again. And her role, she realized with crystal clarity, had always been the same. "I'm hit," one of Valentino's men shouted from near the shattered windows. "Leo's down!" The tide was turning against them. They were outnumbered. Valentino clutched his shoulder, his face pale, but his eyes were still clear, still commanding. He looked at her, then at the chaos unfolding around them. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also the resolve. He made a decision. "Roman," he yelled over the gunfire, "get the chopper, evac plan Delta." He grabbed Evelyn's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "I can hold them off. You need to go, get her out of here." "No," she cried, clutching his arm. "I'm not leaving you." "That is an order, Evelyn," he roared, his face a mask of desperate fury. He was ready to sacrifice himself to save her. It was the ultimate proof, the final, bloody confirmation of what she had started to suspect in the long, quiet hours in the library. His possession had become protection. His protection had become something more. "The secret, Valentino," she yelled back, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. "The hard drive. My father said the truth is not what it seems. It's the key. We have to see the rest of that video." His eyes locked with hers. A silent, desperate battle of wills waged in the heart of the firefight. To run was to survive. To stay was to risk everything on a dead man's secret. With a final, desperate look at the overwhelming odds, Valentino made his choice. He trusted her. "The office, go!" he yelled to Roman, providing covering fire as his massive bodyguard helped Evelyn back toward the glass-walled room. They scrambled behind the desk. The sounds of the battle raging just outside. Evelyn's hands flew across the keyboard, her adrenaline-fueled focus absolute. She found the video file and clicked play. Her father's face reappeared. "The truth is not what it seems." His voice crackled from the laptop's speakers. "Your grandfather and Antonio Caruso, Valentino's grandfather, were like brothers. They started the business together, but it was my Patuas, a doctor, who developed the formula on that drive. He created it to save Antonio's dying wife. But Marco Falcone's father, a junior partner, saw its military potential. He tried to steal it, and in the struggle, he killed your grandfather and Antonio's wife. Antonio Caruso covered it up to protect the family, exiling the Falcones, but he kept the formula, a secret he passed to his son. My debt. It was a fiction, a way for Valentino's father to keep me and my knowledge close, to protect the secret." The video ended. The silence in the office was deafening. The debt was a lie. Her entire captivity had been built on a lie, but a lie designed to protect her, to keep her father's deadly legacy out of the wrong hands. "The compound's main server," Roman grunted, pointing at the screen. "It controls the security systems. If we upload that file, with the Caruso seal..." Evelyn understood instantly. It wasn't just a video. It was evidence. Irrefutable proof of the Falcone family's original sin. As Valentino and his remaining men held the line, Evelyn and Roman uploaded the file. An emergency broadcast protocol, one Valentino had clearly designed for a doomsday scenario, activated. The video, along with authenticated documents from the drive, was instantly transmitted to a secure list of recipients. The heads of the other 5 families, Interpol, and key figures in the city's political structure. The effect was instantaneous. The firing from outside lessened. Shouts of confusion could be heard. The narrative had been controlled. The Falcones were no longer seen as rivals staging a coup. They were exposed as murderers and traitors, violating a code of honor that had stood for a century. Their allies would abandon them. Their power was broken. A single shot rang out, and then silence. Marco Falcone, realizing he was trapped and disgraced, had taken his own life. The war was over. In the aftermath, amidst the smoke and shattered glass, Evelyn found Valentino leaning against a wall, pale and bleeding, but alive. She immediately went to work, her hands steady as she applied pressure to his wound, the familiar rhythm of healing a comfort in the chaos. A week later, the island was peaceful again. The compound had been repaired, the ghosts of the battle scrubbed away. Valentino, his arm in a sling, found Evelyn on the terrace, watching the sunset. "It's over," he said quietly. "The Falcone Empire is in ruins. The other families have realigned their loyalties. The secret on the drive has been secured." He stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "The debt is settled. The story your father started is finished." He turned to her, and for the first time she saw no trace of the crime lord, the captor, or the king. She saw only the man. His eyes were clear, his expression vulnerable. "You are free, Evelyn," he said, his voice raw. "Roman can have the jet ready in an hour. He can take you anywhere in the world you want to go. A new life, a new name, anything. You are no longer my prisoner." She looked at him, at the man who had abducted her, terrorized her, lied to her, and ultimately protected her with his own life. She thought of her small, quiet bungalow, of the predictable life she had lost. It was a ghost, a life that no longer fit the woman she had become. She had walked through fire and emerged stronger, a woman who understood the terrain of shadows and secrets. "My father's story may be finished," she said, her voice soft but sure. "But I think ours is just beginning." A slow, genuine smile spread across Valentino's face, a smile of relief and disbelief and a profound, unguarded love. He reached out with his good hand and gently cupped her cheek. "Where will you go?" he asked, his voice a whisper. Evelyn leaned into his touch, her choice as clear and certain as the stars beginning to appear in the twilight sky. "I'm already home," she said. He leaned in and kissed her. A kiss that was not about possession or command, but about a shared future, a promise made in the aftermath of a storm. It was the sealing of a new contract, one written not of debt and lies, but of trust and a dangerous, undeniable love. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, his emerald eyes searching hers. "From now on," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, his words a perfect echo of a night that felt a lifetime ago, were mine.